Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. This is from the song Anthem by Leonard Cohen. I'm Kate King, and today we're talking about imperfection and how it's literally the only option for all of us. So this is something that I work with on a regular basis in my everyday life because my perfectionist part is very strong. So I'm going to talk today about some of the aspects of imperfection, why we tend to feel like we need to be perfect in our day-to-day lives, and some tools around how to support yourself in your imperfection and explore it and learn to find some endearment and some self-love in your imperfection. Okay, so I'd like to just start with nature because I feel like nature is often a really great representation for so many of the inner pieces within us. So when you look out in nature and you see a tree with a broken limb or flower petals that have grown in sort of a distorted way, you see that even though there is that Fibonacci sequence, which is the golden mean of the spiral where there is a natural perfection to everything, it doesn't always really translate to all things. Sometimes there is great imperfection in things, and this might be for adaptability or survival or resiliency in the world. And I learned in a podcast called Ologies, there was a particular episode that talked about trees. And I learned that when a tree has a branch that dies, it actually just cuts off the supply of nutrients and energy to that branch and just continues growing. So this is a really good example of imperfection and how sometimes it's adaptive and it helps with our survival to accept our imperfections and just keep going. So that's one example in nature that we see with imperfection. I'd also like to share with you the Wabi-Sabi Concept, which is a Japanese concept that just celebrates the sort of simplicity and peacefulness in the enjoyment of everyday objects, even if they're imperfect. So there is a really beautiful Wabi-Sabi concept that is used in pottery art. It's called kintsugi. And it is basically using a golden lacquer to fill in the cracks and the gaps in broken pottery. The concept here is that you don't cast away and disregard your objects or your pottery just because it's broken. Instead, you sort of fuel that broken pottery with your love and with this kind of golden lacquer that really represents that there is beauty in the cracks. It's like the Leonard Cohen song where cracks let the light in. We need them. And being perfect isn't always the goal. Sometimes having cracks can teach us things that we wouldn't have learned before. And sometimes it brings about a much more authentic and organic type of beauty within us as well as within our objects. So we live in a culture that is really high in its standard of success and achievement and perfection in order to feel successful and feel as though you have achieved something in your life of meaning. And we see this in advertisements where there are really unachievable standards of beauty, where there are unachievable standards of wealth and success or relational or marital happiness. There is this ideal of perfectionism out there, and there is a feeling that if you don't look that way or if your life doesn't orchestrate in that fashion, somehow you've come in short and your imperfections have basically served as a type of a failure. So I'd really like to challenge this. I know that this is the overculture that we live in. I understand that this message is all around us, and yet we're not robots. We're people. And if we were made to be perfect, then we would be. But we were given this imperfect human life for a reason. And I like to think of the everyday experience of life as a giant classroom where we're supposed to be learning things. We're supposed to be enriching ourselves as we explore our mistakes and our imperfections and our shortcomings in balance with our strengths and our motivations and the things that we're really successful at. Even superheroes, even myths, even heroes of all kinds, there are imperfections in everyone. Superman is not able to fight Kryptonite, right? So Kryptonite is something from his home planet of Krypton, and it's sort of like a green crystalline substance that has a particular kind of radioactivity that weakens Superman's strength. So Superman is imperfect. And Achilles, in mythology, he has the Achilles heel, which ultimately brings him to his demise. The story of Achilles is that there was a prophecy when he was a young boy that he would die young. So his mother took him to the river, which was the magical river Styx, and she held him by his ankle and dunked him into this magical water, which would create sort of an invulnerability in Achilles, not realizing that the area that she held him in his ankle wasn't submerged in the water. And so years later, in his fight with Paris, he was struck by a poisonous arrow to the ankle. And this is ultimately what killed Achilles. And now we call this our Achilles heel. So Achilles heel was a physical thing in the story of Achilles, but it's also an emotional thing and a kind of intangible part of our world that really represents that imperfection is everywhere. We all have something, some part of us, no matter how strong we are. There's some imperfection in all of us that could be the end of us. It could bring us down to our demise if we're not careful, and that's what creates the sweetness of life, in contrast with the possibility that we could be brought down, or what we have in life may not last forever, because imperfection is inevitable. Okay, so I would like to talk now about how to embrace imperfection. So there's a lot of self words. There's self-love, there's self-compassion, there's self-forgiveness. These words are really important because they relate to the aspect of how we treat ourselves when we feel imperfect, when we notice our inadequacies or the learning edges that we're working on but we haven't mastered yet. And rather than looking outside of ourselves for the kind of support and love and enforcement we need to feel okay in our imperfections, it goes a lot further when it can come from within. So some ways to explore your imperfections are with parts cards. And if you haven't seen my video on parts cards, please scroll back and check that out so you know what I'm talking about. So this parts card represents the imperfection part as evidenced by the perfectionist. The perfectionist who wants everything to be perfect, everything to be in line, and this is actually a protector part. The perfectionist part comes up when there is a feeling of a weaker, more vulnerable, or more exiled energy in the form of another part. So the parts that I'll share with you today as these potential exile parts that could bring the perfectionist protector part forward are, first of all, the fragile human part. This is sort of what we were talking about with the story of Achilles, that our bodies are not bulletproof. We're not immortal, and we do have the vulnerability for illness. We have inflammation, we have disease, and our bodies are doing the best they can, and they're actually incredibly remarkable. However, they're imperfect. So if sort of this fragile human part has come to the surface, then it might make sense that the perfectionist part would stand in front and say, no, focus on me. Look how perfect everything is. Don't focus on that pain or on that cancer diagnosis or on that migraine headache. Another one is the insecurity part. So the insecurity part can be coming from anything within yourself that feels inadequate or lesser than or not capable or weak. And if you're feeling any of this kind of exile, fragile energy of the insecurity part, sometimes that protector part can show up in the form of the perfectionist and kind of try to cover up the vulnerability of the insecurity with a false sense of having it all put together all the time and holding that perfectionist energy. Okay, so lastly, we'll talk about the unloved or unlovable child. So much of our perfectionism issues come from when we're very, very little kids, and we somehow get the message that if we're perfect, then we'll be deserving of love. or we will attract the kind of care and belonging that we so desperately long for. So if somewhere within you, even as adults, if we feel that sort of unloved or unlovable energy within ourselves, it makes sense that that protector part of the perfectionist would come forward and say, look how perfect I am. Don't notice that weak, vulnerable energy of the unlovable child. Notice how perfect I am and love me because of that. So that's how we can work with it with parts cards. Another way to work with the perfectionist tendencies within us, this is an art therapy technique. So I recommend that you use your non-dominant hand to draw. You can draw anything. You can look outside and draw the landscape outside your window. You can draw abstractly. You can create whatever image comes to mind, but I recommend that you use your non-dominant hand so that you take away any expectation of perfection here. Because when we know that we're not using our dominant hand, we don't expect ourselves to make something perfect, and we're able to give ourselves a lot more grace. We're able to meet our image even with humor or with endearment, because we allow ourselves to be imperfect if we set the expectation that that's okay. And sometimes using the non-dominant hand is the perfect portal into allowing for this kind of exploration into the imperfect. All right, so the last tool I'll give you around imperfection exploration is to apply a mindfulness lens to the imperfection. So if you notice that energy stirring within you of feeling imperfection or feeling a strive toward perfectionism or an impulse to hold it all together and to display something perfect about yourself, I recommend that you go inside, you close your eyes and you go to an internal place and you ask yourself, what is this really? This isn't really about needing to be perfect, because cognitively we know that that's not possible. So internally, am I coming from an insecure place? Do I have a chaotic energy within me that the perfectionism is trying to somehow reach, or an antidote for that kind of insecure, vulnerable part? What's going on in my surroundings right now that is evoking this impulse toward perfectionism? And if you can really notice what that is, what's the trigger, what's the stimulus, then you can have a space. Like Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space, we have the power to choose how we respond. So simply noticing that there's been a stimulus and an impulse toward perfectionism, and not just reaching for your automatic sort of autopilot response of trying to be perfect, trying to display a perfect image of yourself, or reach for whatever that perfectionist habit might be, but instead just sit with that discomfort and allow yourself to grow more comfortable with the discomfort of being imperfect or being vulnerable or insecure, or any other number of emotions or experiences that you may be having, and holding space to invite that self-compassion and self-acceptance, or perhaps self-forgiveness into that space, so that you can become more of a friend to yourself, and you can love yourself in all of your cracks, with all of your imperfections, understanding that you are a person who is imperfect, and we all are. And the goal is not perfection. Otherwise, we would have been made that way. So lastly, I'd like to just recommend one really great book. Many of you who know me know how much I love the work of Brené Brown. And so this is her book, The Gifts of Imperfection. It's just really beautiful, and I think it'll help you to sort of explore into imperfection and perfectionist tendencies, and understand how to support yourself and love yourself as you learn to accept and embrace your own imperfections. Hope this was helpful for you guys today, and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care.